What's going on, guys? Welcome to Beyond Politics. This is an in-depth conversation about relevant and political topics of the day. As always, I'm your host, Jared. Joined with me is Seth, and today we're going to be talking about executive orders.
Oh, yeah. Big, bad executive orders.
Exactly. So these have been a pretty hot topic, especially over the last administration and with the current administration. Donald Trump has been talking about hitting the ground running, and he signed a lot of executive orders as a result. So what we're going to kind of do is we're going to define what an executive order is. We're going to talk about how they're typically used and the history of them, and then we are going to provide our perspective about it. So, Seth, why don't you go ahead and run through exactly what an executive order is?
All right. So an executive order, it's pretty nebulous because it's not explicitly talked about in the Constitution, but defined, an executive order is a rule or order issued by the president to an executive branch of the government, and it has the force of law. They're generally used to direct federal agencies and officials in their execution of congressionally established laws and policies. However, if you look through the history of them, there's really no limit, and there's no rigid definition of what they can and can't do. They've kind of been used all over the place. But I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but we're just going to keep talking about where they're kind of based from.
Yeah, so like Seth said, they're not really mentioned in the Constitution. However, we do know that Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution specifically says that all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and a House of Representatives. So the Constitution is very clear that all legislative powers will be granted and vested to the Congress. So Congress is the only branch that has the ability to write law. However, the argument would be that an executive order isn't necessarily law; it's an order.
It's an order that carries the force of law. It's a little weird.
Oh, exactly. Perfect sense.
But it's important to also note that, that's one way it's kind of reeled in. But there's also ways that executive orders can be repealed and overturned.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a couple ways that executive orders can be overturned. One, Congress can propose new legislation that would then kind of overturn the executive order. But in order to do that, they would have to pass the bill in the House and the Senate, and then the president would have to sign it into law. Which
I really don't think he'd be signing one that
overturns his executive order. Exactly. So more than likely he would veto it, which would then require a supermajority because Congress can overrule a presidential veto. However, it requires 2/3 consent of Congress, which I don't think that they
basically never happens.
I don't think that Congress could agree with 2/3 on anything.
No.
So that very rarely happens. But there is another way that it can happen.
Yes, they can be deemed unconstitutional and challenged in the Supreme Court or really any court. A really important and historical moment of this happening was in 1952 when President Truman tried to seize companies' steel mills because he feared a strike. The company sued that the order was unconstitutional. It came up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled it was unconstitutional and thus repealed the order and took it out of effect.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
Those are two pretty big, ways that they can be stopped. Each branch has the ability, as we've seen, to counteract an executive order. One might probably never happen with the Congress,
and the other hasn't really ever happened, but it can be done if the other branches kind of step up to the plate.
Yes,
which doesn't really happen.
And so even though they're not really in the Constitution, there is precedent for them. Executive orders have been passed and being passed since the very first president, George Washington. He back then they weren't necessarily called executive orders. The naming of executive order really didn't come around until 1907, and they were formally named by the Department of State. And then they also started a numbering system to keep track of the orders. It started with Lincoln up until the present, and I think we're right around a little bit over 13,000 orders at this point.
In total.
Which is in total, which is kind of crazy.
Yeah.
But Washington started them, and I think he did them in a very wise way, and he had a lot of thought put into them. I don't necessarily think that still happens, but I think it's important to recognize that what he said about them and how he used them.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, George Washington is the first president of the United States, so he knows that his example will be followed. So he specifically knew that he wanted to kind of use his presidency as a guidepost because anything that he did would be, quote, drawn into precedent. So basically, he was wise enough to understand that his actions would be followed by presidents coming after him.
Dude, he was so freaking awesome, man.
Oh yeah, we just do a whole video about George Washington.
Yeah, I know, right? So just quickly to run through some examples of executive orders throughout the ages. You have the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln. That was an executive order that freed slaves. You have
important.
the executive order that during World War II relocated Japanese citizens of the United States to internment camps.
Good old
That was
FDR.
Executive Order 9066. There's also racial integration of the armed forces was an executive order, and the desegregation of public schools
Yeah.
was a law, I guess, passed as an executive order. And so if you kind of just look through just a couple examples, I mean, you can kind of see the breadth that these things can do. You know, like
Yeah.
they're not always necessarily enforcing things that are already existing. A lot of orders aren't necessarily doing anything. I mean, you have Obama did an order to close Guantanamo Bay within a year. It really was only him saying he'd want to do it because he didn't close it. And then 2 years later, he issued another order saying, just kidding.
Just kidding.
And didn't close it. And so, I mean, there's really the limits on what they can do is kind of...
They range on the scale of what they're actually accomplishing, like you said. No, definitely, and there's a lot of different kind of philosophies and ideas behind executive orders. Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to kind of break 1,000 executive orders. FDR had the most executive orders, but as you can see on this graph right here, it kind of goes through and shows that presidents have been doing it since the very first one, since George Washington. So they have been around for a very long time. Obviously, the amount that they do ranges. But Teddy Roosevelt's philosophy behind it was, if the Constitution doesn't tell me that I can't do it, then I can do it. Basically, was his philosophy behind it. He called it the stewardship theory. So that's how you come up with the first president to kind of break 1,000 executive
and really
orders.
just issue a ton of orders. I mean, the president before him issued under 200, and then he was
and
like,
then he
nope,
jumped it up to 1,000. It's like,
gonna
I
get
can
a
top
lot of
that.
use out of this pen. Yeah.
But yeah, no. What do you? Now that we've kind of laid out what executive orders are and how they've typically been used in the past, there's a lot of criticism of them now. What is your kind of perspective on them and how you think they should be used and implemented?
So, I mean, I kind of like the vagueness of them and the ability for them to cover a lot of ranging issues, because I think things come up that can't be planned for or aren't necessarily don't have the time to be pushed through Congress. Like, I feel like the racial desegregation in public schools would have taken forever to gone through Congress, and that was kind of an important step that we needed to take at that point. Having said that, though, I do not like ruling by executive order. I think abusing them can be detrimental. But creating this very rigid structure that some people think should happen, and I think you kind of fall into that camp, that they need to be better defined. I don't think that is a unfounded opinion. That makes sense. You want to be careful that not too much power is pushed over to one branch of the government, or with the executive order, one person, the president. So that's just my opinion. I kind of like that they're nebulous.
Because
Should
it
they
gives
be
the
abused?
president the ability to kind of act in a situation where fast action needs to be taken.
Yes, and I think if you look at precedent, I really don't think that they have been that abused so far. And so I think putting the faith in the system and that the way they've been being used is how they should be continued, and that it's kind of okay that they're not necessarily super defined is so far. But as soon as like they start being abused, maybe even with this administration, then I definitely think they're going to need to start being reeled in. I really don't know if that's going to happen, though. I don't really think that that's something that's going to pass very easily through the government to restrict power.
Yeah, exactly. The government doesn't really do a great job on honing in their power.
Yeah. So what do you think about it, man?
Yeah, so my perspective on it is I think that the founders were very intuitive in kind of creating a three-branch system where there's obvious checks and balances. Now, George Washington did have executive orders, so I don't necessarily believe that the concept of executive orders are unconstitutional. However, I do believe that the Constitution is very strict about the legislative branch and Congress specifically being the only branch that can pass law. So I think kind of saying, no, it's not a law, it's an order is kind of going around, beating around the bush a little bit, kind of almost a power grab.
Semantics,
kind of
basically.
But
It's like,
yeah, the main thing with me is I don't like one person, the president, having the ability to basically implement a law without there being strict definitions of what his powers are. So I would rather err on the side of this is the restrictions to what you can do. Now go have at it, as opposed to, okay, you can do whatever, and then if we don't like it, we'll reverse it, kind of thing.
yeah. It's like instead of restricting what goes out, what you're just restricting is how quickly you can pull it back in.
Yeah, exactly. And I would rather restrict what goes out than having
Yeah.
to pull something back in. And I kind of err on the side of government doesn't really do that much stuff right. So I'm more cautious with it. I'm more okay with a gridlock system where things move a little bit slower. Obviously, the Emancipation Proclamation and the desegregation of schools are good examples of executive orders that were implemented where Congress didn't act fast enough. However, on an entire scale, I'm more okay with things moving a little bit slower and us kind of maintaining a more tyranny-free government system where there are absolute checks and balances.
Yeah.
Hasn't turned out that way at all. Big shock, but yeah, that's kind of my opinion on it.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, regardless, guys, you tell us what your opinions are about executive orders. Do you think the president should have the ability to write executive orders or law? Are they unconstitutional? Are they not? Be sure and comment below. Tell us what you think. If you like this video, be sure and subscribe to our channel, guys. That really helps us out. And as always, guys, stay informed, and we will see you next week.